Welcome everyone. My name is Mike Gagel. I'm here in my role as the BCLTA president. We have that up and then we can call the meeting to order. So 1902. And so we'll just follow along with the agenda. Item number 1 was calling to order. Item number 2, announcement of quorum. Do we have?
We have quorum.
We have quorum. We have enough members. Good. Thank you very much. Next up then is approval of the agenda. And do we do this like a normal board meeting? No, just.
No, I would just move into the guest.
Perfect. All right. Then we'll just move along and go into slide number 2. And can everyone see that okay? So we are meeting today throughout British Columbia on the territories of Indigenous peoples whose historic relationship continues to the day. And as such, we recognize the inherent Indigenous rights on this land, the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in British Columbia, and the support for the 94 Calls to Action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. With me tonight is the rest of the BC Library Trustees Association Board of Directors. Myself, Mike Gagel, our treasurer is Rhonda Sherwood, and our directors are Aaron Carlson, David Clark, Katie Louie, Alicia Glover, and Brenda Lee. And this is probably why many of you wanted to join us tonight, and we are very honored to have Angela Sterritt with us this evening as our AGM guest speaker. Angela is a member of the Gitskan Nation and is joined by her son, Namawan, who is a member of the Gitskan and Anishinaabe Nations. This was made possible with support from the Libraries Branch, Ministry of Education. And at this time, I will hand it over to Angela and Namawan, and we just need to unmute their microphone.
Okay. Hi everybody, my name is Namawan Jikolalacha Sterritt. I am 9 years old, I am in grade 5, and I am Gitxsan and Anishinaabe. I will be talking about Indigenous people and stories. So I think it's good to have Indigenous stories because it helps keep culture. It reflects my culture and my indigeneity. Oh my God. For many years, Indigenous people Indigenous stories have been passed on for many years to many people. It keeps culture alive. I like it when I go into my mom's workspace and I hear so many Indigenous stories. One thing that helps me is the fact that in grade 4 I got a First Nations Indigenous teacher who was Anishinaabe. I got to learn so many stories. Another thing that helps me is having so many Indigenous stories and books at home and libraries. I like it when I walk into a library and see an entire section based off of Indigenous stories. One thing that we need to work on is racism. Back so many years ago, Indigenous people used to be treated very differently. It was horrible racism, and it still goes on to this day. They were treated differently just because of their culture and their skin. One thing I hope people learn from this is that Indigenous people and stories matter. Now I'd like to pass this on to someone who is very important to me, my mom. Thank you.
You did awesome. Good job.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for hosting me tonight, and my son as well. He does actually a lot of keynotes in person, but this is the first time he's done one on this online format, which is so weird. Probably most people can agree it's different. It's a lot to get used to. So I just want to, first of all, acknowledge the unceded territory, ancestral lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people whose land I am on here today. I am Gixen. I'm a reporter at CBC, and I'm also right now writing my book. It's being published by Greystone. It's called Unbroken, and it's actually about missing and murdered Indigenous women along the Highway of Tears in Manitoba and in the downtown east side of Vancouver. I've been a journalist for over 20 years now, and it's been a really amazing journey. This year, at the beginning of this year, I don't know about anybody else, but it feels like March is like 20 years ago. So my time is all kind of mixed up. But this year I was nominated for Best Reporter of the Year in Canada by the Canadian Screen Awards. Didn't win it, but I was nominated. Huge win. I've gathered a lot of awards over the years, and I attribute that to the Indigenous people in my stories who so graciously trusted me with their stories that often have been shrouded, have been left out, have not been told in the media, excused away. And you might be able to relate to that in your industry, why in your institution, media is an institution as well, why we haven't seen Indigenous stories, Indigenous books up in the forefront until very recently. And I think I just go back before I get into it. Just thank you, Babs, for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and a warm welcome to you wherever you are. I know that a few of you are in Prince George, and that made me feel very at home because I spent a lot of time there. A lot of my family moved from the Hazelton area into Prince George, and it's a place close to my heart. So thank you for having me, and thank you for listening. Like I was saying, right now in Canada, we're sort of in this moment of reckoning, I think. And I had a little bit of fear, and I talked about this in the last couple of talks that I spoke at, just about how I was worried, in May. The reason why we started really talking about this more aggressively, we've been talking about reconciliation for a few years, especially since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report in 2016. But this year, of course, it's been like this massive push to listen and to recognize and to look internally and to take action. And we saw in May, after the death of George Floyd, of Levi Rodney, of Chantal Moore, of so many Indigenous and Black people in Canada, and people were kind of forced to quickly look within and see what are we doing wrong and how can we change the paradigm, but also the way that we reflect on our institutions and all of them. But what made me really afraid was that, May, June, July came, and then in August and September, I started seeing people being like, oh, well, that was then, and now we're kind of back. We're back to the status quo, to the normal, and that was scary for me. But this gives me hope that people still are willing to listen and take an internal look. And one of the things that I saw in May was a lot of letters. So letters from my son's school, letters from PC Optimum, letters from so many different institutions. Many of those letters didn't, these were like emails or letters written to talk about, how we're looking internally and we're addressing racism. Many of those letters didn't use the word Black, they didn't use the word Indigenous, they didn't have an action plan, or they didn't talk about how their institution has engaged or perpetuated racism. And so it was very performative. So that was the fear that I had in May, June, July, and August, was that, oh no, this is performative. And once, we get to August and September, September comes, we're back to normal again. But I do think things like this give me hope, that there's this reckoning, an overwhelming responsibility, calls from Black, Indigenous, and people of color to look inward, to pay attention about, how their organization reflect diverse communities, but also about their commitment to anti-racism. And this is a part and parcel of reconciliation. So I think in reconciliation, like at the beginning, and when people first started talking about reconciliation, we heard a lot about, how can we heal together? But we heard little about, let's recognize that we have a huge part to play in the perpetuation of colonization. So where I work, for example, in the world of media, we perpetuate that every day. And it's what's often confusing and mystifying for me is that we're like non-biased and we're neutral and all of that, but the base for neutrality is colonization. So when you look at, reporting from the 1960s, there was almost like an advertorial nature for advertising child welfare, advertising the 60s scoop, solidifying that residential school is great. Like, let's keep that going. And there was little self-reflection on how harmful that was. And there was little voice given to Indigenous people. Indigenous voices were actually seen as like activisty, right? As anything where you saw Indigenous people speaking out at that time anyways, and I would say up until even now, was often laden with stereotypes that forced them into this role of greedy, wanting more, of being the warrior, being violent, being lazy, being pathetic, all the kind of excuses why I didn't see the stories that I pushed at an early age in my career. I actually started my career in Prince George in 2002. All the reasons why I was told that we couldn't cover those stories because they were already done, because they were too depressing. Nobody cared. And I think that's the way that I can relate to you in the library sphere is that, why didn't we see there's so many incredible authors, and that could be the fault of publishing houses, that can be the fault of agents, that can be the fault of libraries, that can be the fault of educators. But really it's all on us to take a look and see, maybe not what went wrong then, but like what's going on now. And I think that's what's really important to me is that hope. And the hope for me lies in a few things. And that's the paradigm that I see reconciliation in. Personally, right now, I think libraries are doing a really fantastic job. My son, he talked about his Anishinaabe teacher, and she had access to so many books from the library in the school and from the public libraries. And like he was saying, there was whole sections dedicated to Indigenous people. For Indigenous people, that is like, it's not just a prideful moment, but it's like a relief. It's like, oh, okay, finally, because when you're constantly telling people like, we matter, like, please believe our stories, like, we deserve to be heard, it's tiring and it's exhausting. So to see yourself reflected, it's like, it's a relief. And it's like somebody is listening. And so I think there's three kind of things that I think about when I'm thinking about reconciliation for any institution. And the first one is about making space. So whenever I'm talking to BIPOC youth in particular, or Indigenous women, I always talk about it in relation to I think it's a senator, a US Senator, Alexandria Cortez. I'm going to mess up her name, but people probably know who I'm talking about. She's an Indigenous, people are nodding their heads. And I saw this doc she was making. And one of her producers, or might have even been her boyfriend, she was sitting there and she was going like this. And he was like, what are you doing? And she was doing it for a long time. And she's like, I'm taking up space. I'm taking up space. And that's my message to BIPOC people is take up space. And women too, because often, we say, oh, I don't want to take up too much space. I'm just going to do this. And then we'll have the white guy take up 2 hours. How many keynotes have I done where that happens? And I have like 2 minutes and they have like an hour and you don't hear that important voice that you want to hear heard. So making space. So these are a couple of things that I'm going to talk about. I'm mindful of the time. Investigating your own conscious or unconscious bias. So we often hear about unconscious bias, but I think there's a lot to be said about just thinking about the ways that we are conscious of how we are racist. And that's something I've come to terms with and I think about all the time, probably way too much. And the third one is tackling that racism, making a plan, right? So there's always like the first step is like awareness. The second step is talking about it. So this is all the things that we saw in May. We're talking about this reckoning moment in Canada. But we didn't really see people make an action plan. We didn't really see people say, here's our strategy. Here's how we're going to actually, and I don't know about you guys, but I think I'm starting to see that in my institution. It's like, okay, cool. I'm starting to see our plans materialize now, which is amazing. So the first part I want to talk about is the making space. So I'm looking now, of course, not everybody's skin color determines their identity. So there might be a lot of BIPOC people who I can't tell here, but it does seem like there's a lot of white people here. And I think it's really important to, when you're thinking about being inclusive and you're thinking about diversifying your organization, to think about making space. And so for me, for example, I have a bunch of examples, but I'm half Gitsan. So usually when I do something like this, I will ask, is there any way that I can mentor youth? Because eventually I want somebody who's more Indigenous, who's more Black. It's not all about DNA, it's not all about blood quantum, but I want to pass the torch. And I want to make that space for people who are more discriminated than me in society. Right now, in many institutions that I speak at, that I'm part of, there's not one Black person in the institution. And that needs to change. And so in that making the space, you have to ask yourself, why is there not a Black person here? Why is there not an Indigenous person here? And my boss, who's white, was asked this, why is there not a Black person to host this event we're doing? And she said, I don't think they feel safe. I don't think we've made a safe space for them. And that was a real moment for me. And how do you do that? One of the last events that I hosted, somebody said, can you talk about what happens when we do create all these initiatives to bring in more diverse people into our organization, and then that shift is like so intense that it creates conflicts. And I'll give you an example of that. I was actually going to wear my button blanket tonight, but I had a glass of wine, so I decided not to. But I wanted to wear it to explain how cultures can collide, and how when we're thinking about making space and when we're thinking about investigating our unconscious bias, we're thinking about the cultures that we represent, the cultures that we perpetuate, and the cultures that we dismiss, or we don't understand, or we push aside, or we just don't understand. So for example, I'd done the story about a man named Maxwell Johnson. He was a grandfather who, him and his 12-year-old granddaughter were handcuffed at a bank and detained because she was trying to open up her very first bank account. And there was one number that was missing on her status card. They had other ID, but they called 911. It became a huge story, international headlines. And to wrap the story up, I was invited to go to their community, to Bella Bella. And I told my boss, before I told my boss that, Maxwell said, what's your clan? And for me, that was like, uh-oh, like I'm getting gifted something. So now I have to go. But not only that, that's going to collide with journalism, because you cannot accept gifts from people. That's part of our journalistic standards and practices, because it's considered like a bribe. Like, here, I'll give you some donuts and you make me look good or something, right? But in our culture, getting something like a painting or a print or a button blanket, it's an honor that's not about you do this for me and I'll do that for you. It's more of like, this is your responsibility that we trust and we bestow upon you. And sorry, I'm getting sick, so I might be sniffling. And so we had to explain that to CBC, and they were totally blown away. Like, you're getting like a gift, like how much is this? And I didn't even know that I was getting a button blanket at that time. And I was like, I don't know how much this thing is worth, but I think you need to think about, this is a culture that's very different than white colonial non-biased neutrality culture that we've built. That's very white. That's very white, and it's very transactional, and it's very monetary, and it's very based on a system that Indigenous people didn't create. It's at odds with Indigenous governance where there's reciprocity. And I said, I'm going to give them a gift as well, because that's what I would do for in terms of my culture. And I had to stand up in their big house and give a speech, because I knew I was on camera as well, to explain what this meant to me. But it was very interesting how, you know, the top heads in Toronto were just like, this is way too much for us. Like, we can't even believe this. And then I was given a button blanket, which for me was totally not economic or monetary or transactional. It was very spiritual, very spiritual. And I had to go back, and they were like, you can't even do that story now. You know, somebody else has got to do that story, because then it's a perceived bias from the public. So the reason why I'm telling you the story is because I think it portrays and it articulates a really strong example of how, when we're making space, we need to investigate our own conscious and unconscious bias that might not be like, oh, I'm totally racist, like I use the N-word, like I hate Indigenous people, I'm so, you know, they're greedy, they're stereotypes, blah, blah, blah. But like, think about that. Where do you stand culturally within your organization? And it's not to say one is right and one is wrong. Everybody is valued just the same. But it's to think about those perceptions that we have of other. One of the things about making space, so I'm guessing this is a lot about making space I'm talking about, but I think it's so important. It's so important because so many Black, Indigenous, and people of color are really, really tired, really, really exhausted. And I know a lot of people, like for a living, they get paid to educate, and that's great. But a lot of people like me, or for example, Melanie Mark, cabinet minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, people who are doing their job, but then they have to do this whole other job, which is a lot of work of educating people, because it's expected of them. Like, oh, you're Indigenous. Can you tell us how to pronounce this Inuktitut word? And it's like, I'm not Inuktitut. I have no idea about that, but let me go research it for you. Or why is this racist? So making space is also about doing some of that work, taking some of that weight off. A speech that I gave the other day was to all BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, youth. And my speech was all about, you deserve joy. You deserve to feel love. You deserve to walk around the world and not feel like you're looking over your shoulder. You deserve to just do your job, to just be a journalist, to just be a cabinet minister, to just be the face of this campaign or whatever. And in my work, I've been very, very lucky in that I've had a couple, at least, white women pick up the mess and say, you know what? This is racism. This is colonization. This is horrible. This is trauma. This is triggering. And let us go to bat for you, so you don't have to anymore. Because a lot of this stuff, you know, there's trauma from residential school, there's trauma from the 60s scoop, there's trauma from foster care. You know, just last week, a young Indigenous man died in his group home. He was not found for 4 days. So this type of ongoing, I call it intergenerational racism, continues today. And so it's a modern day racism that people are traumatized by. So like my son was saying, and it was really interesting because I said, do you want to do like a keynote? It's about libraries. So, you know, something about, you know, how it's important for you to have like resources that are Indigenous focused. And he said, okay. And he went into his room and came back and he's like, how's this? And he said, racism is still alive today. And I was like, whoa. I mean, true, but also like, wow, you know, from someone who's in grade 4. And talk about a reckoning moment when this is the discussions that he's having in his classroom he's in grade 5 now. And for me, that's where the hope is. The hope for me is, you know, those two white women at work who say, why should you have to be fighting racism all the time when we're the ones who were part and parcel? Like, these are our people who are doing this to you. These are our white colleagues who are constantly, you know, belittling you or excusing the stories or calling you bias or excusing your stories away. Why should you be the one to deal with that when these are our problems, our colonialization to deal with? So I think that making space piece is so critical. And the other thing that I talked about in that speech is the ability for people to maybe not walk in somebody else's moccasins per se, but to wonder, to imagine, to think about somebody else who doesn't have your experience, and to ask respectful questions, but to make that space where there's a limitless possibility for everybody to work together. And I think one of the things that I found really fascinating about the pandemic, and I think in some ways maybe this is getting a little bit too philosophical, but you know, we started to see our lives as invested in each other, not just ourselves. Even though we're at home, but when we go out to the grocery store, we wear a mask, we socially distance. I mostly wear a mask to protect other people from me in case I have something. It's a matter of respect. But we saw people thinking about how you are invested in my health and how my safety protocols are protecting you. And I feel like that new way of thinking, or that reinvigoration of thinking outside of the box and thinking about each other as our communities, really helped us to see in May, when we saw all those deaths of Black and Indigenous people, to sit and see that could have been me. And why does this matter to me? And we had more time to process all of that. And so, yeah, I kind of had this like list of like ways that you can make space, the ways that you can address your conscious and unconscious bias, but I think I already went over that. And then the other one is tackling the racism within your institutions. And I think when we're talking about reconciliation, for me, when I think of that word, part of me is like, oh, like God, because it's so performative in so many ways, and so many people are just like, we're doing reconciliation. We put a totem pole in front of our school, yay. Or look, we did a mural, or look, we wrote a letter. But we don't actually see people making space for Indigenous people, or doing their own education. And I always thought, like, why do people always have to ask me like all these insane questions? I don't mind, because I'm, you know, I put myself out there for this. But also, like, when in May, when George Floyd was killed, you know, I started seeing these Black boxes on social media, and I was like, this seems weird. And I just Googled it. And I was like, you know, people in the Black Lives Matter movement actually don't like this because it's taking away from their hashtag for their messages. But then I went into a whole other kaleidoscope of things, from white tears to don't ask me if I'm okay, to historical racism, to current racism, to the number of Black people that have died over the last couple of years. And I was like, this is really easy. Like, I'm literally just Googling and spending some time researching. And I think that's about making space. So for me, making space isn't just making your spaces more culturally open, but it's also about giving Black, Indigenous people, people of color, some like time to not be working to solve colonialism, to solve racism, to solve, you know, why we're targets of violence, all of this stuff. And so, yeah, but I mean, I think I'm getting towards the end, but I just want to say that I think I think you all are doing a really, really amazing job, and I mean that from my heart. I've interviewed so many librarians who are like almost like nerdy keen to do this right, and are doing it right, and are having like not just like here's the Indigenous section, but like Indigenous youth and Indigenous literature, and inviting that into the space. And you know, it's not just about educating the world, but it's also about bringing Indigenous people into your institution and making them feel like, here I am, I'm represented. And, you know, that's a whole other conversation I can go into about why it's important to feel represented. But yeah, I just wanted to end on that note. I mean, I don't want to keep on talking on and on. I could. But I do want to just say I do have a lot of hope right now. And although I see things, you know, waning and waxing, and sometimes, you know, it's like, oh, we're back at that point again, I continue to speak up. I continue to be vocal. I continue to exhaust myself. I continue to encourage people to make space because it's worth it. In the end, it's worth it when you see, you know, even those 2 white women that I have at my work who have picked up that fight for me. It's like, fine. I mean, this is a 20-year journey of my career of just kind of fighting for stories to be there. You know, I remember for people who are older like me, Lee Maracle, right? I remember her it would be the only book on the shelf at the library. And, you know, she had to fight the fight to get that book published, her first book published, and the rest that came. And now that's where the hope is for me. You know, now we see Wabagijik Rice, Cherie Dimeline. I'm publishing a book that is like very personal and very difficult. It's investigative, and it's investigation and creative nonfiction. And you see so much space being made for Indigenous people to flourish like everybody else. And that for me is reconciliation, when everybody has an equal space, when we see our institutions truly being a space of equality. That's what it means. It means making space for everybody. And I think seeing your commitment and seeing the work that you've done, seeing my son come out and being able just to talk so candidly about racism, it's the books he's read, it's the leaders that he's had, it's the space that's being made for him. And so, yeah, I just want to thank you for listening and for doing the hard work, especially the BIPOC people here, and for everybody, and for picking up that torch, and for listening, and for, you know, committing to make a difference.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you very much. Yeah, I guess we can just show our applause because the microphones are all muted. Thank you for sharing your story, and also Namawan for being brave and to come on and address all of us tonight and share his story. And Angela, I hadn't appreciated that how tiring and exhausting it can be to tell a story, tell your story. So I appreciate the effort. And, you know, we're at the end of a day, and if, like most people, we have jobs, and, you know, we are doing this after a long day at work. But you also addressed hope, and how those of us who are not Black, Indigenous, or people of color to make space. And so I hope that you feel that you had the space tonight to deliver your message. And I thank you very much on behalf of everybody in attendance, because they can't address you. So thank you.